November 1943. While Italian families in Naples rationed their final reserves of flour and olive oil, surviving on barely 900 calories a day, across the Atlantic Ocean in rural Texas, 51,000 Italian prisoners of war sat down to meals that would have fed entire villages back home. In the mess halls of Camp Hereford, these captured soldiers received plates piled with fried chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans glistening with bacon fat, and thick slices of cornbread still warm from the oven. The daily caloric intake exceeded 3,200, more than triple what their families were scraping together in bombed-out cities. But it was not the food alone that shattered these men. It was what came after dinner, when guards unlocked the recreation halls and wheeled in barrels of cold American beer, sold at 10 cents a glass, that something fundamental began to shift in the hearts of soldiers who had been taught to die for Il Duce. How did a simple glass of Texas brew break down the walls of fascist pride? And how did that moment of bitter surrender transform into the foundation of an American dream that would reshape an entire industry? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Marco Lombardi stepped off the transport truck at Camp Hereford with his boots caked in North African sand and his ribs pressing against the thin fabric of his uniform. The scale in the intake building registered 127 pounds for a man who stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. His service record, hastily translated by an army clerk, noted his pre-war weight at 168 pounds. 41 pounds lost in 18 months of desert combat and retreat. The intake officer, a heavy-set sergeant from Oklahoma with sweat stains darkening his khaki shirt, looked at Lombardi's hollow face and shook his head slowly, making a notation on the medical form that would follow the Italian captain through his entire internment. The first evening in the camp dining facility arrived with the smell of roasting meat drifting through the open windows of the barracks. Lombardi had not eaten anything beyond thin broth and hardtack in 3 days of transport. His stomach had tightened into a fist of constant pain. When the dinner bell rang at 1700 hours, he joined the line of Italian prisoners shuffling toward the long tables where American cooks in white aprons stood behind steaming trays. The man ahead of him, a former sergeant from Sicily named Giulio Rossi, whispered a prayer under his breath as a cook dropped a full chicken leg onto his tray, followed by a mound of potatoes that seemed obscene in its quantity. Lombardi sat at a table with 11 other officers, men he recognized from the fighting at Kasserine Pass. None of them spoke. They stared at their trays as if the food might vanish if they looked away. The chicken was tender, falling from the bone with the slightest pressure of a fork. The potatoes had been whipped with real butter and milk, rich and creamy in a way Lombardi had forgotten was possible. Green beans had been cooked with chunks of salt pork, the fat rendering into the vegetables until they tasted like something from a feast day before the war. He ate slowly, mechanically, feeling his stomach rebel and then gradually accept the nourishment. Around him, other men did the same, some with tears streaming silently down their faces. The medical officer at Camp Hereford was a thin man from Massachusetts named Dr. Harold Weinstein who kept meticulous records of every prisoner's condition. His weekly reports to the War Department detailed the transformation of Italian POWs with clinical precision. In the first month after arrival, the average weight gain ranged from 9 to 14 pounds. Cases of malnutrition dropped from 42% on intake to less than 8% within 6 weeks. The instances of vitamin deficiency diseases, pellagra, and beriberi, conditions that had plagued the Italian army in North Africa, virtually disappeared by the 3rd month of internment. Dr. Weinstein's notes from December 1943 recorded his observation that many prisoners appeared healthier after 2 months in captivity than they had been in 2 years of military service under Mussolini's crumbling empire. The Geneva Convention protocols, enforced with bureaucratic rigidity by the United States Army, mandated that prisoners of war receive the same quality and quantity of rations as American troops stationed at the same facility. This was not mercy or generosity in the traditional sense. It was adherence to international law, a demonstration that America respected the rules of warfare even when the enemy had failed to do so. For the Italians at Camp Hereford, however, the distinction between legal obligation and kindness became meaningless. They were being fed better than they had eaten in their entire adult lives. The cognitive dissonance created by this reality, the fact that captivity meant abundance while freedom had meant starvation, worked on the prisoners in ways that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. Lombardi's barrack held 32 men, divided into 2 rows of bunks with a central aisle wide enough for footlockers. The building had electric lights, a coal-burning stove for winter heating, and wooden floors that did not leak when it rained. In the corner, someone had hung a small mirror salvaged from a broken window. Men lined up to shave each morning, using razors provided by the camp commissary and soap that smelled of pine and left their skin feeling clean for the first time in years. The simple act of grooming, of seeing oneself looking less like a starving refugee and more like a human being again, had an effect that the camp psychologist, a young lieutenant named Robert Chen, documented in his monthly reports. Dignity, he wrote, could be restored through small acts of normalcy, and those acts built bridges that barbed wire could not destroy. The turning point came on a Saturday evening in mid-December when the camp commandant, Colonel James Hendricks, authorized the opening of the recreation hall for weekend use by prisoners who had demonstrated good behavior. The hall was a converted warehouse with a concrete floor, folding chairs arranged in rows, and a makeshift stage at one end where the camp band sometimes performed. But what caught the attention of every Italian prisoner was the row of wooden barrels stacked against the far wall, each stamped with the logo of Lone Star Brewery. American beer, cold and plentiful, available for purchase at 10 cents per 8-ounce glass. Lombardi stood in the doorway of the recreation hall with his hands in his pockets, watching other prisoners approach the barrels with expressions of disbelief. In Italy, beer had never been part of the cultural fabric the way wine was. But in North Africa, the Germans had brought their beer rations, and Italian soldiers had learned to appreciate the bitter, yeasty taste as a small comfort during the endless heat and flies. Here in Texas, the beer was different. It was lighter, crisper, served so cold that condensation formed on the outside of the glass within seconds. Lombardi paid his 10 cents, money earned through camp labor at 80 cents per day, and carried his glass to a corner table. The first sip was a shock. Not because of the taste, though it was good, but because of what it represented. He was a prisoner of war, technically an enemy of the state, sitting in a recreation hall drinking beer purchased with money he had earned working in the camp motor pool. The contradictions piled on top of each other until they stopped making sense. How could defeat taste like this? How could captivity feel more like freedom than the years he had spent serving in Mussolini's army, starving in the desert, watching men die from preventable diseases because supply lines had collapsed under the weight of incompetence and corruption? Giulio Rossi sat down across from him, his own glass of beer held carefully in both hands. Rossi had been a schoolteacher before the war, a man who spoke 3 languages and had dreamed of opening a bookshop in Palermo. The war had taken those dreams and ground them into dust. Now he sat in a Texas prison camp, drinking American beer, and trying to understand what his life had become. They did not speak about the war. That was an unwritten rule among the prisoners. Instead, they talked about small things. The quality of the beer. The strange flatness of the Texas landscape. The way the guards spoke English with accents so thick that even men who had studied the language in school could barely understand them. These conversations, quiet and unremarkable, were acts of reconstruction. They were men learning to be human again, one small interaction at a time. The beer program at Camp Hereford was not unique. Across the American South and Midwest, prison camps housing Italian and German POWs operated similar systems. The logic was straightforward. Prisoners who were treated well, who had access to small luxuries and earned modest wages, were less likely to cause problems. They worked harder, cooperated more fully, and presented fewer security risks. The policy was pragmatic, not humanitarian, though the effect on the prisoners was the same regardless of the motivation behind it. For men who had known nothing but scarcity and brutality for years, the simple act of choosing whether to spend their earnings on beer, cigarettes, or writing paper represented a form of agency they had forgotten existed. Lombardi began working in the camp motor pool in January 1944. His background as the son of a mechanic in Brescia, where his father had repaired trucks and farm equipment, made him a natural fit for maintaining the camp's fleet of vehicles. The work was familiar, almost comforting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He spent his days with his hands covered in grease, diagnosing engine problems, replacing worn parts, and teaching younger prisoners the basics of automotive repair. The motor pool sergeant, a gruff man from Detroit named Mike Sullivan, treated the Italian prisoners with rough equality. If they worked hard and did not cause trouble, he left them alone. If they slacked off or made mistakes, he dressed them down with a stream of profanity that required no translation. Sullivan had served in the First World War and carried a deep skepticism about all things military. He had no particular love for the Italians, but he also had no hatred for them. They were just men doing a job, same as him. This attitude, casual and unsentimental, confused Lombardi at first. He had expected contempt or at least condescension. What he found instead was something closer to indifference, and in that indifference was a strange kind of respect. Sullivan did not care about Lombardi's politics or his past. He cared about whether the trucks ran properly and whether the work got done on time. In the evenings, after the work details returned to the barracks and dinner had been served, Lombardi began spending more time in the recreation hall. The beer had become a ritual, a way to mark the end of the day and create a space between the labor of captivity and the uncertainty of the future. He sat with the same group of men each night. Rossi, the former teacher. Antonio Bellini, a farmer from Tuscany who had never seen the ocean until the army shipped him to North Africa. Carlo Ferreira, a stonemason from Rome who spoke with his hands and told elaborate stories about the buildings he had worked on before the war. These men became a kind of family, bound together not by blood or ideology but by shared experience and the strange grace of survival. The beer they drank came from breweries scattered across Texas and the surrounding states. Lone Star, Pearl, Shiner, names that meant nothing to Italian prisoners but would become familiar through repetition. The taste varied slightly from barrel to barrel, but the ritual remained constant. 10 cents for a glass. A seat at a corner table. Conversation that danced around the edges of memory without diving too deep into pain. This was how healing happened, Lombardi came to understand. Not through grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but through small, repeated acts of normalcy that slowly rebuilt the architecture of a shattered self. The winter of 1944 brought cold that none of the Italian prisoners had anticipated. Texas, they had been told, was hot and dry. No one mentioned that winter nights could drop below freezing, that the wind across the plains could cut through wool uniforms like they were made of paper. The camp issued extra blankets and coal for the barrack stoves, but the cold still found ways to seep in through gaps in the walls and floors. Men huddled close to the stoves, drinking coffee that the Americans made strong enough to strip paint, and talking about home in ways they had avoided before. Lombardi spoke rarely about his family. His father had died in 1938, killed in a factory accident that left his mother to run the small repair shop alone. She had written to him twice since his capture, letters that took months to arrive and had been heavily censored by both Italian and American authorities. The words that remained told him almost nothing. She was alive. The shop was still operating. His younger sister had married a man from Milan. These facts floated in his mind like debris from a shipwreck, pieces of a life that felt increasingly distant and unreal. What consumed his thoughts instead was the beer. Not the drinking of it, though that remained a pleasure, but the making of it. In the motor pool, he had begun asking Sullivan questions about American breweries, about how they operated, how they distributed their products, what made one brand more successful than another. Sullivan, surprised by the interest, brought in copies of trade magazines and newspapers with articles about the brewing industry. Lombardi read them slowly, looking up unfamiliar words in a battered English-Italian dictionary that circulated through the camp. The more he learned, the more fascinated he became. Brewing was engineering and chemistry and art combined into a single process. It required precision and patience and an understanding of how raw materials transformed under specific conditions. The principles were not so different from what he had learned working on engines. Both involved taking disparate components and assembling them into something that functioned smoothly, efficiently, elegantly. The difference was that beer created something that brought people together, that facilitated conversation and connection, that marked celebrations and eased sorrows. There was something noble in that, Lombardi thought. Something worth dedicating a life to. By spring, he had made a decision. If he survived the war, if he was allowed to return to Italy, he would find a way to work in a brewery. If such opportunities did not exist at home, he would look elsewhere. Perhaps even here, in America, if such a thing was possible. The idea seemed absurd. He was a prisoner of war, an enemy alien, a man with no money and no connections. But the seed had been planted, and it grew in his mind the way crops grew in the fields surrounding the camp, slowly but inevitably, drawing sustenance from sources he could not fully explain. The recreation hall expanded its offerings in the summer. In addition to beer, the camp began stocking bottles of Coca-Cola, boxes of Cracker Jacks, and tins of tobacco. The prisoners, flush with earnings from their labor details, spent freely. Some sent money home through the Red Cross. Others saved every penny, hoarding their wages against an uncertain future. Lombardi fell somewhere in between. He bought his beer and occasionally splurged on a Coke, but mostly he saved, watching his account grow in the small ledger book that each prisoner maintained. The guards at Camp Hereford represented a cross-section of American society that the Italian prisoners had never encountered before. There were farm boys from Kansas and Oklahoma who treated the whole enterprise of guarding enemy soldiers as just another chore, no different from mending fences or feeding livestock. There were factory workers from Detroit and Chicago who brought urban cynicism and rough humor to their duties. There were college students who had enlisted thinking war would be glorious adventure and instead found themselves supervising men who posed no threat and wanted nothing more than to survive until they could go home. These guards were not the monsters that fascist propaganda had promised. They were ordinary men doing an ordinary job, and their very ordinariness was revolutionary to prisoners who had been raised on myths of American decadence and moral corruption. One guard in particular, a young corporal from Wisconsin named Eddie Kowalski, took an interest in Lombardi's growing obsession with brewing. Kowalski's grandfather had emigrated from Poland and worked for decades in the Milwaukee breweries before retiring with a modest pension and a lifelong love of beer. When Kowalski learned that Lombardi was reading everything he could find about the industry, he began bringing in books from the camp library and magazines from his personal collection. The two men would sit in the motor pool during breaks, drinking coffee and talking about fermentation temperatures, hop varieties, and the economics of distribution. These conversations violated no rules. They were simply two men sharing a mutual interest across the divide of captivity. Through Kowalski, Lombardi learned about the great breweries of America. Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, Pabst in Milwaukee, Schlitz, Miller, Coors. He learned about Prohibition and how it had nearly destroyed the industry, forcing breweries to pivot to making near beer and ice cream and other products until the law changed. He learned about the challenges of scaling production, about the regional loyalties that made some brands dominant in certain markets while failing completely in others. He absorbed this information with the intensity of a man who had found his calling and refused to let it go. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the prisoners at Camp Hereford remained in limbo. Italy had already surrendered in 1943, but the process of repatriation was slow and complicated by the chaos of post-war Europe. Ships were needed for other purposes. Ports were clogged with military equipment and supplies. Bureaucracies ground through paperwork at their own pace. Months passed. The summer heat returned, more oppressive than the year before, turning the camp into a landscape of dust and sweat and waiting. Lombardi continued working in the motor pool. He continued drinking beer in the recreation hall. He continued reading everything he could find about brewing. But now a new possibility had entered his thinking. The war was over. The fascist government had fallen. Italy was rebuilding under Allied occupation. What if, instead of trying to return to a country that would be changed beyond recognition, he stayed here? What if he found a way to make a life in America, to work in the industry that had captured his imagination, to build something new from the ruins of his old life? The idea terrified him. He spoke no English beyond basic phrases. He had no legal status beyond that of prisoner of war. He knew no one outside the camp except guards and officers who would forget him the moment he left. But the alternative, returning to Italy with nothing, facing the judgment of neighbors who would see him as either a traitor for surrendering or a fool for losing, seemed equally impossible. At least in America, he would be starting from nothing rather than from less than nothing. At least here, the future felt open rather than closed. In August, the camp received word that repatriation would begin in October. Men who wanted to return to Italy would be processed in order of their capture dates and rank. Those who wished to apply for permission to remain in the United States could file paperwork through the camp administration, though such applications would face intense scrutiny and had no guarantee of approval. Lombardi spent 3 days agonizing over the decision before filling out the application forms. The questions were invasive and humiliating. Why did he want to stay? What skills did he possess? Did he have any relatives or contacts in America? Had he ever been a member of the fascist party? He answered as honestly as he could. He wanted to stay because he saw no future in returning to a devastated country. His skills included automotive repair and a growing knowledge of brewing processes. He had no relatives in America but had developed a professional relationship with Corporal Kowalski, who had agreed to write a letter of recommendation. And yes, like virtually every Italian of his generation, he had been required to join the fascist party to attend university and secure employment. It was not an ideological commitment. It was survival. The application went into a folder that joined hundreds of others. Weeks passed without word. Men began leaving the camp in groups of 50 and 100, loaded onto trains that would take them to ports on the East Coast and ships bound for Italy. Lombardi watched them go with mixed feelings. Part of him envied their certainty, their ability to embrace the familiar even if it meant hardship. Another part of him felt relief that he had chosen differently, that he was gambling on the unknown rather than retreating to the known. In November, 3 weeks after the last transport of repatriates had departed, Lombardi was summoned to the camp commandant's office. Colonel Hendricks sat behind a desk covered in files and documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression revealing nothing. He gestured for Lombardi to sit and then slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. The application for residency had been approved, conditionally. Lombardi would be released from Camp Hereford under a special provision that allowed certain POWs to remain in the United States as civilian workers. He would be required to report monthly to an immigration officer. He would be prohibited from traveling outside the state of Texas without permission. He would need to secure employment within 60 days or face deportation. The conditions were strict, but they were also a lifeline. Lombardi's hands shook as he read the document. Colonel Hendricks watched him for a moment and then spoke in slow, careful English that Lombardi mostly understood. The commandant said that he had reviewed Lombardi's record during his time at the camp. He had been a model prisoner. He had worked hard. He had caused no trouble. More importantly, Corporal Kowalski had written a strong letter of recommendation, and so had Sergeant Sullivan from the motor pool. These endorsements carried weight. America needed men who were willing to work, who had skills, who could contribute to rebuilding after the war. If Lombardi was serious about staying, about building a life here, then he would have that chance. 3 days later, Lombardi walked out of Camp Hereford wearing civilian clothes provided by the army, carrying a small duffel bag with his few possessions, and holding a slip of paper with an address in Houston. Kowalski had arranged for him to stay temporarily with a friend of his grandfather's, a retired brewery worker named Franz Mueller who ran a boarding house near the docks. It was not much, but it was a beginning. The bus ride to Houston took 7 hours through flat countryside that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. Lombardi sat by the window, watching farms and small towns pass by, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones. He was free but also more alone than he had ever been. No one was waiting for him in Houston. No one cared whether he succeeded or failed. The anonymity was both liberating and terrifying. Mueller's boarding house was a 2-story wood frame building with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The old man who answered the door was short and round with a white beard and suspicious eyes. He looked Lombardi up and down and then spoke in German accented English that Lombardi barely followed. Mueller gestured him inside, up a narrow staircase to a small room on the second floor. The room had a bed, a chair, a small table, and a window overlooking the street. The rent was $8 a week, payable in advance. Lombardi counted out the bills from his camp wages and handed them over. That first night in Houston, he lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. Ship's horns from the port. Traffic on the street below. The hiss and clank of radiators warming the building against the winter cold. He thought about the recreation hall at Camp Hereford, about the beer he would not drink there tonight, about the men he had known who were now scattered across the ocean or returned to homes that no longer existed. He thought about his mother in Brescia, about whether she would understand why he had chosen to stay, about whether he would ever see her again. Sleep came eventually, fitfully, and when he woke the next morning to gray light filtering through thin curtains, he felt the full weight of what lay ahead. He had 60 days to find employment or face deportation. He had no connections, no references beyond a letter from a prison camp guard, no experience in any industry except automotive repair and that incomplete education in brewing he had cobbled together from magazines and second-hand books. But he also had something that many men lacked. He had survived the desert, survived capture, survived 2 years of captivity, and emerged with his will intact. If he could survive all that, he could survive this. Mueller came upstairs that morning with coffee and bread and sat at the small table while Lombardi ate. The old man spoke slowly, sensing that Lombardi struggled with English, and explained the neighborhood. The boarding house was in a district filled with immigrants. Poles, Germans, Czechs, Italians, Irish, all packed into narrow streets and competing for work on the docks or in the factories. Jobs were plentiful in the post-war boom, but good jobs were harder to find. Men with connections got the good jobs. Men without connections took what they could get. Lombardi asked about breweries. Mueller's expression softened slightly. There were 3 major breweries in Houston, he said. Southern Select, Grand Prize, and Gulf Brewing Company. All 3 were expanding after the war, hiring men to work the bottling lines, to drive delivery trucks, to maintain equipment. Getting a job on the production floor would be possible. Getting a job anywhere else would require more than just willingness. It would require proof of skill and knowledge. Over the next week, Lombardi walked to all 3 breweries and filled out applications. At Southern Select, the hiring manager barely glanced at his paperwork before telling him they were not hiring Italians. At Grand Prize, the response was more polite but equally discouraging. The company preferred to hire men with family connections to existing employees. At Gulf Brewing Company, the receptionist took his application and said someone would be in touch if a position opened up. Lombardi walked back to the boarding house each evening feeling the weight of rejection and the ticking clock of his 60-day deadline. On the 12th day, Mueller mentioned that he still had contacts at Pearl Brewery in San Antonio. It was a 3-hour bus ride, but Pearl was a major operation, much larger than the Houston breweries, and they were actively recruiting workers to keep up with post-war demand. Mueller could make a phone call, he said, mention Lombardi's name to an old friend who worked in the maintenance department. It was not a guarantee, but it was better than what he had now. The phone call was made. 2 days later, a letter arrived instructing Lombardi to report to Pearl Brewery for an interview on the following Monday. He bought a bus ticket, borrowed a tie from Mueller, and spent the weekend rehearsing English phrases and reviewing everything he had learned about brewing over the past year. The stakes could not have been clearer. This was his chance. If he failed, he would be on a ship back to Italy before spring. San Antonio surprised him. The city had a character different from Houston's industrial sprawl. There was history here, visible in the old Spanish missions and the winding river that cut through downtown. Pearl Brewery sat on the northern edge of the city, a sprawling complex of brick buildings and steel tanks that covered several city blocks. Lombardi arrived an hour early and stood outside the gates, watching trucks come and go, trying to calm the anxiety that made his hands shake. The interview was conducted by a man named Thomas Keller, the assistant brewmaster, who had worked at Pearl for 23 years. Keller was a tall, severe-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of pausing long seconds before speaking. He read Lombardi's application slowly, occasionally glancing up to study the nervous Italian sitting across from him. The questions came in waves. Where had Lombardi learned about brewing? What did he know about fermentation? Could he read and interpret technical specifications? Had he ever worked with industrial equipment? Lombardi answered as best he could, his English halting but determined. He explained his time in the motor pool at Camp Hereford, his mechanical background, his reading and self-education about brewing processes. He spoke about Corporal Kowalski and the books and magazines he had studied. He admitted his lack of formal training but emphasized his willingness to learn, to work any hours necessary, to prove himself. Keller listened without expression and then asked a question that caught Lombardi off guard. What, in Keller's own words, makes a good beer? Lombardi thought carefully before answering. He spoke about balance, about how the bitterness of hops must complement the sweetness of malt, how carbonation should enhance flavor rather than overwhelm it, how clarity and color affected perception even before the first sip. He spoke about consistency, about how every bottle must deliver the same experience, how that required precision at every stage of production. And he spoke about pride, about how a good beer reflected the skill and care of everyone who touched it, from the farmers who grew the grain to the workers who packaged the final product. When he finished, Keller was quiet for almost a minute. Then he stood, extended his hand, and said that Lombardi could start the following Monday as a general laborer on the bottling line. The pay was 65 cents an hour. The hours were long. The work was hard. If he proved himself, there might be opportunities to advance. If he did not, he would be gone within a month. Lombardi shook his hand firmly and thanked him in careful English. Walking out of the brewery into the bright Texas sunlight, he felt something he had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Hope. The sense that the future was not fixed, that his choices mattered, that the life he was building was truly his own. The bottling line at Pearl Brewery operated 16 hours a day in 2 shifts. Lombardi worked the early shift, arriving before dawn and leaving long after the sun had crossed its peak. The work was monotonous and physically demanding. Bottles moved in endless procession along conveyor belts, filled with amber liquid, capped by mechanical arms, labeled and packed into wooden crates. His job was to watch for jams, clear blockages, replace worn parts, and maintain the rhythm that kept 40,000 bottles moving through the system each day. The noise was constant, a mechanical thunder that made conversation impossible and left his ears ringing long after he clocked out. Within 3 months, he had memorized every quirk of the bottling machinery. He knew which bearings ran hot, which belts stretched faster than others, which pressure gauges could be trusted and which needed constant verification. The maintenance supervisor, a gruff Texan named Roy Hastings, noticed Lombardi's attention to detail and began giving him more complex assignments. Rebuilding pump assemblies. Calibrating filling mechanisms. Training new workers on proper shutdown procedures. The pay increased to 75 cents an hour, enough to move out of Mueller's boarding house and into a small apartment near the brewery. His English improved through necessity and immersion. He listened to the radio each evening, repeating phrases until they felt natural. He read newspapers slowly, dictionary in hand, building vocabulary one word at a time. At work, he forced himself to speak even when it was easier to remain silent, accepting corrections and learning from mistakes. The other workers tolerated him at first and then gradually accepted him. He was the Italian who worked harder than anyone, who never complained, who could fix machines that others had given up on. That reputation carried weight in a place where results mattered more than origins. 2 years after starting at Pearl, Keller summoned him to the brewhouse. The assistant brewmaster had been watching Lombardi's progress and saw potential beyond mechanical skill. He offered him a position as a junior brewer's assistant, working directly with the production team to maintain quality control and assist in batch formulation. The pay was 90 cents an hour, and more importantly, it was entry into the craft he had dreamed about since those first evenings in the Camp Hereford Recreation Hall. The brewhouse was sacred space. Massive copper kettles gleamed under overhead lights. The air was thick with steam and the sweet, earthy smell of malted barley. Thermometers and pressure gauges covered every surface, monitoring temperatures and flow rates with precision that determined whether a batch succeeded or failed. Lombardi spent his days learning the alchemy of brewing. How water chemistry affected flavor. How different hop varieties contributed bitterness, aroma, and stability. How yeast strains transformed sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide while creating the complex flavor compounds that distinguished one beer from another. Keller was a demanding teacher. He accepted no shortcuts, tolerated no assumptions, and insisted on understanding the why behind every step of the process. Lombardi absorbed everything, filling notebooks with observations and calculations, staying late to monitor fermentation tanks, arriving early to test gravity readings and pH levels. The work was exhausting but satisfying in ways that surprised him. He was building something, contributing to a product that brought pleasure to thousands of people, and doing it with skill that he had fought to acquire. By 1950, Lombardi had become Keller's most trusted assistant. When the head brewmaster retired, Keller was promoted and immediately recommended Lombardi for the assistant brewmaster position. The promotion came with a salary of $5,000 per year and responsibility for overseeing daily production operations. He was 34 years old, 7 years removed from his last day at Camp Hereford, and for the first time since the war, he felt that he had truly arrived somewhere solid. The Korean War brought new challenges to the brewing industry. Raw materials became scarce as the government diverted resources to the military. Labor shortages intensified as young men were drafted. Competition increased as regional breweries fought for market share in an industry consolidating around major brands. Pearl responded by modernizing its facilities, installing new fermentation tanks, upgrading bottling lines, and expanding distribution networks across the Southwest. Lombardi was at the center of these changes, designing workflow improvements, training new brewers, and ensuring that quality remained consistent even as production volumes increased. In 1953, he met Catherine O'Brien at a church social organized by San Antonio's Catholic community. She was a schoolteacher, the daughter of Irish immigrants, with dark hair and a quick smile that made him feel less foreign than he had in years. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony attended by brewery colleagues and a handful of friends. Catherine brought stability to his life, a sense of belonging that he had not realized he was missing. She laughed at his still imperfect English, corrected his grammar gently, and made their small apartment feel like the home he had left behind in Italy. Their first child, a daughter they named Maria, was born in 1954. Holding her in the hospital room, Lombardi felt the full weight of what he had built. He was no longer a prisoner of war or a displaced refugee struggling to survive. He was a father, a husband, a skilled professional with a future that extended beyond himself. The journey from that first night in Camp Hereford to this moment seemed impossible in retrospect, a sequence of unlikely breaks and stubborn persistence that had somehow resulted in an actual life. Keller retired in 1956, and the brewery board named Lombardi as the new head brewmaster. At 40 years old, he was the youngest person to hold the position in Pearl's 70-year history. More remarkably, he was the first foreign-born brewmaster at a major American brewery. The local newspaper ran a feature story about his journey from prisoner of war to brewing executive, complete with photographs of him standing beside the copper kettles and a quote about believing in American opportunity even when circumstances seemed impossible. The publicity brought unexpected attention. Other Italian former prisoners of war reached out, men who had also stayed in America and were building their own lives in different industries. Some had become farmers in California's Central Valley. Others worked in construction or manufacturing. A few had opened restaurants or import businesses. They shared stories of struggle and success, of maintaining connections to their Italian heritage while embracing their American identities. Lombardi realized he was part of a larger phenomenon, a generation of men who had experienced the worst of war and found redemption in the opportunities of peace. Under his leadership, Pearl Brewery expanded its product line and increased production by 40% over 5 years. He introduced new quality control standards, modernized fermentation processes, and developed relationships with hop growers and maltsters that ensured consistent supply of premium ingredients. The company's flagship beer won awards at industry competitions, and distribution expanded into new markets across the South and West. By 1960, Pearl was the 8th largest brewery in America, employing over 800 workers and producing more than 1 million barrels annually. His success allowed him to bring his mother to America in 1958. She arrived at 68 years old, frail and disoriented by the journey, speaking no English and uncertain about leaving the only home she had known. Lombardi settled her in a small house near his own, hired a housekeeper who spoke Italian, and visited her daily. Watching her slowly adapt to San Antonio, learning to navigate supermarkets filled with abundance she had never imagined, reminded him of his own early days in Houston. The displacement never fully disappeared, he realized. You learn to live with it, to build new connections that overlay but never quite replaced what you had lost. The brewing industry continued consolidating through the 1960s. Regional breweries were bought out by national brands with larger marketing budgets and more efficient distribution systems. Pearl fought to maintain independence, investing in advertising campaigns and expanding its sales force. Lombardi focused on what he could control, maintaining quality and developing new products that appealed to changing consumer tastes. The work was constant and often frustrating, but it kept him engaged and gave purpose to days that might otherwise have felt empty. In 1965, Catherine was diagnosed with breast cancer. The disease progressed quickly despite aggressive treatment. She died in early 1966, leaving Lombardi devastated and struggling to maintain equilibrium. His daughter Maria, now 12 years old, became his anchor. He threw himself into being present for her, attending school events, helping with homework, learning to cook meals that approximated what Catherine had made. Work became secondary, a necessary obligation rather than a calling. He continued to perform his duties competently, but the passion that had driven him for 2 decades had dimmed. The turning point came in 1968 when the brewery board offered him the position of executive vice president, overseeing all production operations across Pearl's expanding network of facilities. It was a promotion that would have thrilled him years earlier. Now it felt like a burden, additional responsibility when he was barely managing what he already had. He almost declined. Then he thought about Catherine, about what she would have said, about her belief that challenges were opportunities in disguise. He accepted the position and threw himself into the work with renewed determination. The new role required extensive travel, visiting Pearl's satellite breweries in Louisiana and Oklahoma, meeting with distributors and retailers, representing the company at industry conferences. Lombardi had always been most comfortable in the brewhouse, surrounded by kettles and fermentation tanks. Now he found himself in boardrooms and convention centers, making presentations and negotiating contracts. The skills required were different from those that had brought him this far, but he adapted as he had always adapted, learning through observation and persistence. By 1970, Maria had graduated high school and enrolled at the University of Texas. Lombardi's mother passed away quietly in her sleep that same year at 80 years old. He sold her house and found himself living alone for the first time since marrying Catherine. The solitude was both painful and strangely liberating. He was 64 years old, financially secure, respected in his industry, and unsure what the next chapter of his life should look like. The answer came in 1972 when Miller Brewing Company approached Pearl about a potential merger. The consolidation trend that had been reshaping the industry for years had reached a critical point. Independent regional breweries could no longer compete effectively against national brands with unlimited advertising budgets and coast-to-coast distribution. The choice facing Pearl's board was stark. Merge with a larger company and maintain some operational autonomy, or slowly decline into irrelevance and eventual closure. After months of negotiation, the board voted to accept Miller's offer. Lombardi was offered a position as Senior Vice President of Brewing Operations for Miller's Southwestern region, overseeing multiple facilities and reporting directly to corporate leadership. It was the culmination of a career that had begun on a bottling line 30 years earlier. He accepted with mixed feelings, proud of what he had achieved but mourning the loss of Pearl's independence. The brewery that had given him his chance, that had bet on a former prisoner of war when no one else would, was being absorbed into a corporate giant. He retired in 1975 at 69 years old after 3 years with Miller. The retirement party was held at Pearl's original brewhouse, attended by colleagues from across his career, former employees, and industry figures who had watched his rise from unlikely immigrant to brewing executive. Speeches praised his technical skill, his leadership, and his role in modernizing Texas's brewing industry. What they did not mention, because most of them did not know, was the deeper transformation his journey represented. Lombardi had arrived in America as a defeated enemy soldier, malnourished and uncertain, drinking beer in a prison camp recreation hall and dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. He was leaving as a man who had helped shape an industry, who had raised a daughter, who had built a life from literally nothing. The arc of that transformation, from captivity to leadership, from scarcity to abundance, from outsider to insider, was the real story behind the professional accomplishments. In his final years, Lombardi became something of an elder statesman in San Antonio's Italian-American community. He gave talks at local schools about immigration and opportunity. He mentored young people entering the brewing industry. He maintained correspondence with other former prisoners of war who had stayed in America, sharing stories and supporting each other as they aged. Maria married and gave him 3 grandchildren who knew him as Nano, the old man with funny accent who told stories about the war and always had chocolate in his pockets. He died in 1989 at 83 years old, survived by his daughter, grandchildren, and a legacy that extended beyond the thousands of barrels of beer he had brewed. His obituary in the San Antonio Express-News ran 2 columns and included a photograph from his early days at Pearl, showing a lean young man in work clothes standing beside a fermentation tank, looking directly at the camera with an expression that mixed determination and hope. What the obituary could not capture was the complexity of his internal life. The guilt he carried for surviving when so many others had not. The conflicting loyalties between his Italian heritage and his American identity. The moments when he heard a certain song or smelled a particular scent and was transported back to Camp Hereford, to the recreation hall, to the taste of that first cold beer that had somehow changed everything. These private struggles never fully resolved. They became part of who he was, woven into the fabric of a life that had been built across 2 continents and 2 identities. The brewing industry continued evolving after his death. Craft breweries emerged in the 1990s, challenging the dominance of major brands and returning emphasis to small batch quality and local character. Pearl Brewery closed its San Antonio facility in 2001, ending a legacy that stretched back to 1883. The buildings were eventually converted into a mixed-use development with restaurants, shops, and offices. A small museum commemorating the brewery's history included a display about Marco Lombardi, featuring his photograph, brewing notebooks, and a few bottles of beer he had helped create decades earlier. His story became part of the larger narrative about post-war immigration and the unexpected pathways that brought people to America. Historians studying Italian prisoners of war discovered his name in camp records and interviewed his daughter about his experiences. Graduate students writing theses about the brewing industry examined his technical innovations and management philosophy. But the emotional core of his journey, the transformation from enemy soldier to American success story, remained most powerful in its simplest form. A man who had nothing was given a chance. He took that chance and built something lasting. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through thousands of small choices made over decades. Through learning when he wanted to give up. Through adapting when circumstances changed. Through believing that the future was not predetermined by the past. That was the real legacy, more valuable than any professional achievement. It was a testament to resilience, to the possibility of reinvention, and to the strange grace that sometimes emerges from the worst circumstances. In the end, Marco Lombardi's life proved that defeat need not be permanent, that captivity could lead to freedom, and that a single glass of cold American beer shared in a Texas prison camp could become the seed of an entirely new life. The journey from prisoner of war to brewing executive was improbable, almost impossible, yet it happened. and in happening, it demonstrated truths about human potential and American opportunity that transcended the specifics of one man's experience. His grandchildren grew up drinking craft beers from small breweries that might never have existed without the industry innovations their grandfather helped pioneer. They raised their glasses without knowing the full story of how their family came to be American, of the hunger and desperation that preceded the success, of the camps in the wire and the small acts of unexpected kindness that changed everything. But perhaps that was as it should be. The past served its purpose by making the present possible, and then it receded, leaving behind only the life that had been built upon its foundation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.